They say fire reveals the truth. But before flames ever touched the walls of our estate, the real burning had already begun, quiet, invisible, and constant. I lived in that house not as a daughter, not as a sister, but as a tolerated shadow. That moved silently between rooms. My name is Elise, and long before they left me behind in the flames, it already erased me with colder things. Silence, mockery. And the kind of subtle rejection that doesn't bruise the skin, but hollows. The soul. My family is what they call old money. The Marwoods, known in 3 counties. K articles in business magazines. Charity galas. Country club whispers. But behind the glossy family portraits was a truth no photographer ever caught. I was the unwanted one. My mother died when I was 10. My father remarried when I was 12 to a woman who brought with her a son and a silence that never left. Sienna Marwood, her stepmother, was beautiful and bitter. She called me darling in public, and that girl at home. Her son. Drew was everything I wasn't. Charming, loud, athletic. He had the bedroom with a fireplace. I had the attic with the creaking pipes. He had the birthday parties. He had chores and apologies. Still, I tried to earn my place. I kept my head down, earned top marks in school, wrote quietly in journals I never showed anyone. I worked weekends at the local library to save for college, not because I had to, but because I knew no one would help when the time came. At family dinners, my father barely looked at me. He loved me, I think, but he was tired, and Sienna had him wrapped around silk-gloved fingers every time I tried to speak. To share a thought, to mention a new short story I'd written, someone would cut me off. Drew would crack a joke, Sienna would sigh loudly, and my father would say, "Elise." Not now. Not now became the story of my life. The night before, everything changed. The Marwoods were hosting their annual spring gala, an over-the-top tradition held in the grand ballroom of our estate. I wasn't invited. Of course not. But I helped. The staff, anyway. Ironed napkins. Arranged flower centerpieces. Cleaned wine glasses I'd never be allowed to drink from. I wore my mother's old locket beneath a simple blouse. No makeup. No jewelry. I blended in like part of the wallpaper at one point. I passed Drew in the hallway. He stopped, looked me up and down, and grinned. "Didn't know ghosts walked before midnight?" He laughed and walked away. I didn't respond. That was the thing about being forgotten. After a while, you forget how to speak. That night I went back to the attic. Kate could hear the music pounding through the floors below, laughter clinking. Glasses, elegance I'd never be part of. I sat on the floor beside my bed, pulled out my journal, and wrote one sentence. When you're not seen, do you even survive in people's memory? Little did I know, the answer would arrive in flames. The next day. The air still smelled like champagne and roses. Glitter clung to the staircase like a ghost of the night before. I walked past the ballroom early in the morning to help the cleaning. Crew again, unasked but expected. My fingers were raw from polishing glass. No one thanked me as I carried folded tablecloths through the foyer. I heard footsteps. Drew and Sienna, still dressed in last night's glow, sipping espresso. Drew noticed me. "Oh, look," he smirked. "The help is still here." Sienna didn't even glance up. "Don't leave those cloths on the antique bench, Elise," she murmured. "You know better." I nodded, swallowed the words forming in my throat, and turned away. By noon, the house was buzzing with post-party laziness. Staff moved quietly. My father had already gone into town for a meeting. Sky grew darker, clouds rumbling like a warning. I retreated to my attic room. The ceiling sloped. A single window looked out over the woods. It was cold in winter, sweltering in summer. No one else went up there, which made it mine in a sad, territorial way. I lay on the bed, fully clothed, and closed my eyes. That's when the knock came. Not on my door, but downstairs. Urgent and heavy. I sat up. Then came the voice. Panicked, yelling, a maid screamed. Someone shouted, "Fire!" Then glass broke. The sharp, unmistakable sound of a window exploding from heat. My blood ran cold. I ran to the door. pulled it open, smoke, thick, black, and suffocating already. Curling up the stairwell, I coughed. Tried to scream for help. My voice barely broke through the air. I stumbled down 2 steps, then stopped. The heat was unbearable. My lungs burned. I turned back to my room, slammed the door, stuffed a towel beneath it. The window, I could break it. I could jump. But the drop, it was 3 stories, no tree branch, no ledge. Nothing to break the fall. I pounded on the wall, screamed into the floorboards. I could hear voices downstairs, running, doors, slamming, footsteps pounding on the main staircase, and then silence. I heard them leave. I heard them leave me. I crawled toward the door again, desperate. Pushed it. Open, just a crack. Through the swirling smoke at the far end of the hallway, I saw a figure. It was Drew. He looked at me, eyes wide, mouth open. I called out, "Help me." He froze. For 1 heartbeat, 2, I thought he would run toward me. Instead, he turned away and disappeared down the stairs. I blacked out moments later. The smoke overwhelmed me. I remember coughing, falling against the floor, one hand gripping the locket around my neck, and then nothing. No light, no rescue. Just darkness. They didn't save me, not my brother, not my stepmother, not a single soul in that house. If you've ever felt abandoned by those who were supposed to protect, you subscribe now. Her survival story is just beginning. I didn't die that night, but a version of me did. The quiet girl in the attic. The one who still held out hope that maybe, one day, her family would love her back. She didn't make it. What did survive was something new when I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me wasn't mine. It was white, sterile, with a flickering light and the faint beep of machines. Somewhere close, I was in a hospital bed. My arms were bandaged, my chest wrapped tight, my throat raw as if I'd swallowed glass. A nurse saw my eyes flutter and rushed to call someone. Another nurse followed. "You're safe," one said gently. "You were unconscious for almost 36 hours, but you're stable now." I tried to speak. My voice came out like a whisper dragged across gravel. "What happened?" The nurse's expression shifted. There was a fire at the Marwood estate. Most of the house was damaged. You were found in the attic. Found, I rasped. She nodded. By a groundskeeper. Mr. Nolan said he heard something upstairs after everyone else had already evacuated. Everyone else evacuated left. I turned my face away. "Your lungs are inflamed, but you're lucky," she said. "They didn't." "Think you'd make it, they?" I asked. "Sure, family," she replied. Then added after a beat, "No one's come by. But maybe they're just overwhelmed with everything." I didn't reply because I knew the truth. They weren't overwhelmed. They were finished with me. I spent 6 days in the hospital, no visitors, not one. Sienna didn't call. Drew didn't check in. It's not even a message from my father's office. "And my father?" I asked eventually. "He passed," the nurse said quietly. "Smoke inhalation. He was in the wing next to the library. They couldn't get to him in time." I didn't cry. I just stared at the ceiling until the pain in my chest moved from physical to emotional, like something inside me had finally snapped free and was floating away. On the 7th day, Mr. Nolan, the groundskeeper, came. To see me, a gruff man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands, he sat beside the bed and said nothing for a while. Then finally, with his head low, he whispered, "I saw them leave. All of them." I asked if anyone was still inside. Drew told me no. He shook his head, jaw clenched. I didn't believe him. Something didn't feel right. I ran back in. "Anyway, you saved me," I said. He nodded once. "You deserved better." When I was discharged, I didn't go back to the estate. I checked into a small inn on the edge of town. I used my library savings to buy a new journal. On the first page I wrote, "My family left me to die. Now I'm going to teach them what it means to be forgotten." They left her in the flames. but now she's rising from them. Subscribe to follow her journey from abandoned to unstoppable. The inn was quiet, tucked between a gas station and a row of maple trees just outside town. It was nothing like the estate. No chandeliers, no marble floors, no staff in polished uniforms. Just silence, clean bedsheets, a kettle in the corner, and a place to breathe for the first time in years. I felt the absence of my family not as a punishment, but as a gift. That night, I opened my email for the first time since the fire. There were 3 messages. None from my family. One was from the hospital billing department. The other was a notice from the Marwood legal office informing all parties of a memorial ceremony for my father in 2 days. The third was a group photo. Someone had posted on social media the surviving Marwood Sienna in black, perfectly styled. Drew, clean-shaven, wearing the same smug smile he wore to the gala. The caption read, "Despite the tragedy, the Marwood family remains strong. A quiet goodbye to our patriarch. A private gathering among loved ones. No mention of me, not even a tag. I didn't attend the memorial. I didn't need to. I already knew what they'd say, how Sienna would cry for attention, how Drew would whisper about the will, how I'd be erased like smoke from the walls. But I did go back to the estate, not to speak, not to be seen, to retrieve what was mine. The house was quiet when I arrived, scorched in places, boarded up in others. It still reeked of ash and pride. I used the side entrance, the one I'd used for years, like a servant in my own home. Mr. Nolan had left it unlocked, just as promised. Whatever they didn't give you, he'd said, go take it. I crept up the back staircase, avoiding the main foyer where family portraits once hung, the ones I was never in. I found my father's study untouched. The fire hadn't reached it. The door was locked. But I knew where he kept the key, inside a hollowed-out dictionary on the second shelf. I opened the desk drawer, sifted through documents, tax files, blueprints, property deeds, and then the folder. WILL revision, PILG inside. A letter, dated 2 months before the fire, handwritten. My father's signature at the bottom. Elise, I have wronged you with silence. I have allowed others to dim your light because I lacked the courage to confront the ones I loved, but I see you, seen you for a long time. This is your home, more than it is anyone else's. I am working to revise the will. You will inherit the estate and controlling shares. The others will receive their fair portions. But this house, this legacy, it's yours. My hands trembled, tears threatened, but I didn't let them fall. He'd tried. He hadn't saved me from the fire. But maybe he'd tried to save me from something worse, a lifetime of being erased. I folded the letter and tucked it into my coat pocket. Then I stood in the center of the study, surrounded by everything they tried to keep from me, and whispered, "You burned the house down, but you left the matchbox in my hand." They tried to bury her truth, but she just uncovered their biggest mistake. Scribe, the real revenge starts next chapter. The Marwoods thought it was over. The fire had consumed everything except their entitlement. They wore their grief like designer coats, performing sadness on cue. The whispers in the town said, at least the family is pulling together after the tragedy. But I knew better. I was the secret they buried in the ashes. 2 days after retrieving my father's letter, I booked a meeting with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, Joan Everett, the woman who handled estate law for half the counties. Elite, sharp, brutal, expensive. When I arrived at her office and introduced myself, she raised an eyebrow. A Marwood. The forgotten one, I replied, and slid the letter across her desk. She read it in silence, then again, slower. This was never filed, she said. I know. It could still hold weight, especially if there are witnesses to his intention. Anyone who can corroborate. Mr. Nolan, groundskeeper. My father confided in him once, said he was planning to make things right. Joan leaned back in her chair. "Well then," she said, "let's ruin some brunches." 3 days later, received the first blow. The Marwoods had already executed the old will, filed just a month before my father's letter. The one that left everything to Sienna and Drew, the estate, the properties, the business shares, even the antique car collection. I wasn't even mentioned. Not once, as if I had never existed. I sat with that paper in Joan's office, staring at the emptiness of my name. The silence wasn't new, but this time it was legal, signed, stamped, final dot almost. "This isn't over," Joan said. "They'll say I'm doing it for revenge," I whispered. "Good," she replied. "Let them. Because that means they finally know you're coming." The next morning, Joan filed a petition to challenge the will. Grounds: suppression of a newer intended version, beneficiary manipulation, and possible neglect leading to life-threatening harm during the estate fire. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about truth and legacy. The Marwoods reacted exactly how I expected. First came the letter from their lawyers, dripping with civility, demanding I respect the family's mourning. Then the message from Drew: "You're really going to play victim again. You're lucky we didn't press charges for trespassing." I didn't reply, but I screenshotted every word. And then came the whisper networks. Old acquaintances reaching out, distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. "Elise, is it true? You were in the house during the fire? They didn't even look for you." Suddenly, silence was no longer protection for the Marwoods. It was exposure. Their polished image began to crack. In the meantime, Joan and I worked day and night. She pulled surveillance footage. She found inconsistencies in the old wills. Witnesses. She found records of my father's canceled meetings, including one with a different lawyer, who confirmed he was helping draft a new revision before the fire cut everything short. It wasn't just legal strategy now, it was a reckoning. One night, I sat in my hotel room, holding my father's letter, and whispered to no one, "You tried to fix it, now let me finish what you couldn't." She was erased from the will, but now she's rewriting the story. Subscribe before the next twist hits. The courtroom wasn't a place I'd ever imagined myself. Not because I feared it, but because I never thought I'd be seen enough to reach one. But there I stood across from the very people who had left me behind. And I wasn't just present. I was prepared. The petition to challenge the will was granted a hearing. The estate, worth over $27 million in properties, stocks, and assets, was now in legal limbo, pending resolution. Drew arrived with his usual arrogance, wearing a tailored suit and sunglasses indoors. Sienna played the grieving widow in widow's black, a pearl handkerchief resting delicately in her lap, as if she'd lost more than a bank account. They expected pity. They got evidence. Joan stood before the court with calm authority. "Your Honor," she said, "we are not disputing that the previous will exists. We are asserting that it does not reflect the intentions of the deceased based on new evidence uncovered after the tragedy." Then she laid it out. My father's letter, signed and dated, expressing full intent to revise the will and leave the estate to me. Testimony from Mr. Nolan, the groundskeeper, confirming he heard my father discuss this plan multiple times. A voicemail from a lawyer who was supposed to help file the changes cut short by the fire. Medical documents showing I was left behind during the blaze. I watched Sienna's face shift from porcelain calm to cracked disbelief. "This is ridiculous," she whispered to her lawyer. "This is proof," Joan said aloud, staring her down. The judge agreed to take the case under advisement. We had done more than raise doubt. We had planted a reckoning. That evening, I returned to the house one last time. Mr. Nolan let me in through the side gate. The study was sealed off. I had permission, court-ordered. There was one more thing I needed. Inside the old desk, hidden in a panel I'd remembered from childhood, was a safe. I used my birthday as the code. It clicked open. Inside, a photograph of my mother, a gold watch, and a sealed envelope. marked private for L. I opened it. Inside was a second letter. If you're reading this, it means the first letter didn't reach the courts in time. I was a coward. Not because I didn't love you, but because I let others decide what was worth loving. You were never invisible to me. I just didn't know how to fight for you without destroying everything I built. But I should have burned it all for you. If they try to take this house, this name, show them this. Let the fire finish what I couldn't. I cried for the first time since the attic, not because I was sad, but because, finally, someone had seen me. A hidden letter, a forgotten daughter, a legacy rising from ash. Subscribe. The fire is just beginning to spread. The hearing was scheduled for 10 a.m., but by 9:30, the courtroom was already full. Not with strangers, with family, distant relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years, old friends of my father, reporters from a small local blog who had picked up the estate case after rumors of a daughter left in the fire went viral. Suddenly, the Marwoods weren't just fighting me, they were fighting attention. And attention was something they could no longer control. When I walked in, heads turned. Not because of what I wore, it was simple, black, nothing flashy, but because I walked in with Joan Everett, holding my father's final letter and a court order allowing us to present new evidence. Drew stared at me from across the room, arms folded. Sienna offered a pitying smirk, as if I were some misguided girl trying to play grown-up in a world built for wolves. But I wasn't there to impress them. I was there to finish what the fire started. Joan stood before the judge and presented everything. The first letter, the safe discovery, the testimony of Mr. Nolan, the financial timeline, and finally, the court's permission to submit all materials as new intent evidence under the Probate Preservation of Wishes Act. Your Honor, she said, we are not speculating. We are honoring a man's documented intention, one interrupted by sudden death, and nearly erased by those who stood to gain from his silence. The judge leaned forward. And the response from the respondents, Sienna's lawyer stood. There is no notarized revision. The will executed is legal. This is nothing more than emotional manipulation from someone who was barely acknowledged by the deceased. I stood, not Joan, me. I was barely acknowledged because they taught him not to see me. I said loud and clear. But in his last act, he opened his eyes, and now I'm doing the same. There was silence in the room. Even the judge stared at me longer than I expected. The ruling didn't come that day. It came 2 weeks later in an envelope delivered to Joan's office. I won. The court ruled in my favor, citing the father's clear and documented intent to revise the will. The unusual circumstances of the fire and the petitioner's survival, and the pattern of familial exclusion and material suppression by the respondents. It was awarded 75% of the estate full ownership of the Marwood house, controlling shares in the Marwood family company. Rue and Sienna were left with the remainder, and a permanent note on public record that they left me behind. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Drew. You think this makes you better than us? I typed my response slowly. No. I think this proves you were never anything to begin with. And I blocked him. She rose from the ashes. Now she holds the empire. Subscribe because next they come begging. The papers came in gold-trimmed. Folders delivered by courier, ownership documents, deed transfers, banking access, business stock certificates. Everything my father once held in his name, now mine. The ink wasn't even dry before the call started, Sienna. First, I didn't answer, then drew 6 missed calls for voicemails, all ranging from smug to desperate. You're still part of this family. Let's talk like adults. You don't know what you're doing? Please. Please. The boy who laughed when I cried in the attic. The man who looked me in the eye during the fire and walked away. Now he said please. I didn't answer his calls, but I did make one of my own. To the Marwood estate lawyer. I'm making A few changes, I told her, such as, first, the house is being renovated. Not for them, for something better. Understood? Second, I want the Marwood Foundation dissolved and reborn under my name. New mission, new board. That may raise some eyebrows. Good, I said. Let them lift their brows. I'll be too far above to notice. 3 weeks later, I returned to the estate. Alone. The building was quiet, scarred by fire, yet still standing like me in the grand hall. I ran my fingers across the railing where Sienna once scolded me for standing too close during parties. Touched the frame where my photo had never hung. I walked the hallway where I'd last seen Drew. Walking away, and then I stood in the middle of the marble foyer and said aloud, no one came back for me when I was burning. So now, I don't owe anyone water. The renovations began the next morning. The portraits were taken down, the rooms were gutted, the locked pantry, where I once snuck in for meals, was opened wide. I left only 2 things untouched. My father's old study. The attic. The place I nearly died in would remain as a reminder, not of pain, but of what I overcame. I held a press conference brief. Intentional. The Marwood estate will now operate as the Elise Foundation, dedicated to housing and funding young adults who've aged out of foster care or been displaced by family abandonment. Reporters asked why this cause. I simply said, because I know what it's like to be thrown away. That night, Sienna showed up at the gates. I didn't let her in. She screamed through the intercom, "You ungrateful little girl! You think you're powerful now? You'll lose it all. You're nothing without us." I didn't respond. Instead, I pressed a button on the remote, the same gate remote Drew once held, and let the iron doors swing silently shut. She owns the house. She owns the name, but will she forgive the past? Subscribe. The answer is not what you expect. 6 months later, the house didn't look like the place I grew up in. The scorched wood was gone. The ballroom had been transformed into a community. Library. The bedrooms, once filled with cold laughter, were now temporary housing for displaced girls. And the attic. It was exactly the same. Unpainted. UNFIXED. Preserved. Not because I couldn't afford to change it, but because I refused to forget every Friday. I hosted a dinner in the main hall. Not a gala, not a fundraiser, just long tables, warm food, open doors. People came who had been rejected by their own families, kids with nowhere to go, elderly folks without visitors, artists, nurses, workers. I saw myself in all of them, and they saw me not as Elise Marwood, but as someone who had once been forgotten and chose to remember everyone else. Drew never came back. Last I heard, he'd taken a marketing job in another state. He tried to use the Marwood name. It got him. Laughed out of the room. Sienna moved to Florida. She tried to sue. She lost. She sent me one final letter. "You've ruined everything your father built." I never replied. But in my heart, I whispered the truth. No, I just burned what needed to be burned and used the fire to forge something better. 1 year after the fire, I stood at the estate gates again, this time not as a ghost trying to be seen, but as a woman who had survived, who had reclaimed her name, and who had built something worth living in. I lit a single candle that night and placed it in the attic window, the same place I nearly died, and then I wrote in my journal, the one I'd carried through every chapter. They didn't save me from the fire, but I didn't let them burn the best parts of me. I became the flame, and now I light the way for others. From abandoned to unstoppable, her story proves healing is the greatest revenge. Subscribe for more stories that rise from the ashes.